Hi guys, I'm back to read chapter 8 of What is the Declaration of Independence. I hope you had a great weekend. I was outside today. My hair's a little blown, I'm sure you can tell. Doing a birthday drive-by for my aunt. I don't know if any of you have had to do that, but I hope you're having a good time and you are getting outside and getting some fresh air on nice days like today when it's not raining or snowing. It's a little crazy this week, but we're going to read chapter 8 to 11 this week, and that will end our book. So let's get started with chapter 8, which is entitled Declaring Freedom. What needed to be done next was clear. The American colonies had to tell the king that they demanded to be their own country, apart from Great Britain. The notice they sent the king would have to make it completely clear that the colonies had no choice but to go to war. They did not expect the king to be persuaded by anything they said, but they did want other countries to understand that the colonies had been forced to rebel against the King of Great Britain. But who was best suited to write something so important and dangerous? Remember, they had sent 2 other letters to the king trying not to go to war, and he chose to ignore them. So that's why they did not think that he would be persuaded by anything that they wrote. So here are a couple pictures of the men who were gathered together trying to figure out who was going to write this very, very important letter to the king. The members of the Second Continental Congress turned to 5 men: Ben Franklin of Pennsylvania, John Adams of Massachusetts, Robert Livingston of New York, Roger Sherman of Connecticut, and Thomas Jefferson of Virginia. The group thought Jefferson should write it by himself instead of trying to do it together. Jefferson wasn't so sure about that. He and Adams were close friends. Why didn't Adams try writing it? But John Adams wouldn't do it because, as he told Jefferson, "You can write 10 times better than I can." So the job fell to Thomas Jefferson. For 2 weeks he worked on the first draft of the Declaration of Independence. He was renting a second-floor room in the home of a Philadelphia bricklayer. Remember, he was from Virginia, so he didn't live in Pennsylvania, but that's where they were meeting for the Second Continental Congress. So he had to rent a space to work in. The house was on the outskirts of town. Jefferson wanted to be away from the noise of the city. He used a quill pen that he had to keep dipping in a bottle of ink, and he wrote on large, oversized sheets of paper. He wrote early each morning, stopping when his room became too hot. There's a little picture of the house where he was writing. This is a little side note. It says pen, ink, and parchment. Today, pens are manufactured so cheaply that losing one or having it run out of ink is no big deal. However, in the 1700s, writers made their own pens. They used a quill, one of the large feathers from the wing of a tail of a bird. Have you ever seen one of these in a movie or on the TV or a cartoon where they're writing with a big feather? So that was the kind of pen that Thomas Jefferson used when he wrote the Declaration of Independence. Quills from geese, crows, or swans were commonly used. Thomas Jefferson owned special geese, so he'd never run out of supplies. The tip of the quill was sharpened with a knife to make a pen point, and then the quill was dipped in ink. Ink was made from all kinds of things like berry juice or even soot from the fireplace. The signers of the Declaration used iron gall ink from melted metal and plants. Important documents were written on paper, but on parchment, which was made from dried animal skin. The Declaration of Independence on display at the Library of Congress is on parchment. Rich colonists who didn't want to make writing supplies by hand could buy them from a shopkeeper. Traders often sold fancy European quills, ink, and parchment at the local seaports. I'm going to show you a little picture there. That's the pen with the big feather, and he would dip it in the ink, and that is how he wrote the Declaration of Independence. We think we have it bad with the pencil situation. Never having enough pencils. Can you imagine if we had to use feathers and ink? Later in the day, Jefferson spent time with other delegates from across the colonies. Even though he was kind of a quiet man, Jefferson talked a lot about the Declaration. With his friends Franklin and Adams, he frequently discussed what needed to be included. So Ben Franklin and John Adams were good friends of Thomas Jefferson, and he would go to them and make sure that they agreed with what he was putting into the Declaration of Independence. Because remember, he was speaking for everybody. This was not just from himself. Sometimes when he returned in the evening to his room, Jefferson would crumple up what he had written before and start over. The Declaration would start a war. Jefferson understood that fellow colonists would die because of his words. Jefferson was a scholar, a man of learning. He had read many, many books and written many papers on various subjects. Here's a picture of Thomas Jefferson, and you can see he's taking this very seriously because he knows what he writes and what the king reads is going to start a war, and people are going to die because of what he puts in this letter. It was a period of time between the mid-1600s and late 1700s when men turned to the power and truth of science over what they saw as the superstition of religion. He had read many of the great thinkers of the day, such as John Locke of Great Britain. Locke put forth a daring idea that human beings are born with certain rights, and these rights cannot be given or taken away by kings. Thomas Paine's common sense also made a big impact on Jefferson. In writing the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson tried to combine ideas of new thinkers with the political goals of the American colonies. The Declaration of Independence had to do two important things. One, explain why the colonies needed to break away from Great Britain and King George. And two, describe what the new country stood for. Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence in 4 parts. The first part was an introduction explaining that the Declaration would show why the colonies needed to be free. In the second part, Jefferson laid out the ideas on which the new country would be built. After living without representation in Parliament, the new country would be governed only by the consent of the governed. That meant citizens would have a say in what the new government did, and every man would have the right, turning the page, to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is the most famous part of the Declaration of Independence. Again, remember it is talking about men. Women were not going to be full citizens allowed to vote. We talked about that before, that at this time, women did not have any of those freedoms and those rights yet. Now we know today we do, and they are in the Constitution, but initially that was not the case. The third part was the longest. In it, Jefferson lists all the unfair things Parliament and the King did to the colonies, imposing taxes, stopping trade, closing down colonial governments, and forcing colonists to let British soldiers live in their homes. The King had heard all of this before, but Jefferson wanted the whole world to see how badly Great Britain had treated the colonies. In the final part, Jefferson introduces the name of the new country, the United States of America. He also clearly states that Great Britain will have no control over the United States. None at all. Jefferson was pleased enough with what he had written to show it to Ben Franklin and John Adams. Both suggested a few very minor changes, which Jefferson made. The Declaration of Independence was ready to be presented at the Second Continental Congress. And there's a little side note here about Richard Lee's declaration. Richard Lee was a wealthy Virginian and a strong opponent of King George III. Lee wrote articles and fought against the Stamp Act and the Intolerable Acts. He also helped organize groups in different colonies that worked together to fight against the British. Lee's hatred for the British was clearly on display during the Second Continental Congress. On June 7, 1776, Lee proposed the following. Resolved, and this is a quote, that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiances to the British Crown, and that all political connections between them and the state of Great Britain is, and ought to be, totally dissolved. Many members of the Second Continental Congress agreed with Lee, but not enough colonies were willing to support Lee's proposal to pass it. However, Thomas Jefferson was so impressed with Lee's powerful proposal that he used the exact wording in the Declaration of Independence to announce that the United States of America would be completely free from Great Britain. And that's a picture of Lee. So there were lots of people who were influencing Thomas Jefferson. He was trying to take all of the ideas that the delegates who met for the Continental Congress had discussed and had wanted in the document, but he was by himself when he was writing it. So he's finished with it. Tomorrow we will find out what happens when he brings it to the Continental Congress and what they think of his Declaration of Independence. Look at the form below. Answer the couple questions. They're not too many, but take your time. Think about what I talked about today. Not so much what we talked about in the past, because a couple people are getting a little confused. But think about the book. Think about what you've heard, and do your best to answer the questions. You should be able to see if you're right or wrong when you submit it. I miss you guys. I hope you're all staying healthy. Hope you're happy and you're getting outdoors and getting some fresh air. I'll see you soon.